On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will look at the G20 summit that just took place, India being handed over the presidency of G20. And other than that, the India ASEAN summit, also the US midterm elections. What does it mean for the Democrats now that the Republicans have managed to gain control of the House? Harsh, let's start by the G20 summit and let's look at what happened in Bali. Of course, the summit was dominated by a couple of bilateral meetings that took place, and the Puller sides and the Xi-Biden meeting, all that. But before we go into that, also, did you see any kind of difference in the mood at the G20 summit this time? I remember when the newly elected Prime Minister of Britain, Rishi Sunak, was leaving for the G20, he did say that this is not going to be business as usual because this is taking place also when the Russia-Ukraine war is still on. And Putin wasn't there, of course, but Lavrov came, but Putin's absence was looming large over the G20. Russia was being discussed, and the sidelining of Russia in a way. So how did that, the geopolitical developments, affect the G20?
Yes, I think, it has been an interesting G20. And in fact, it has been G19 rather than G20 because of Russia was not there. And I think the communique itself reflected the tone and tenor of the engagement, when I think there was consensus that and there was a pushback against Russia in terms of the war and the demand that Russia should immediately cease provocative action. So I think there has been a pushback against Russia, but I do think that this was an important G20 because for perhaps the geopolitical fault lines were categorically in place, and I think the idea that there is no time to lose was also there hanging, because we are living at a time where geopolitics and geoeconomics are getting very, very entangled. And, this platform was created for economic reasons. This is an economic and financial platform created to manage economic problems, global economic problems. And here we were this time, in particular, the fundamentals of geopolitics and how they are now shaping our understanding of the global economic order, how they are shaping the trajectory of the global economic order, were very vividly explicated. And I think that's the challenge now for G20 going forward, for India as the next president going forward. How do you make sure that G20 retains its relevance, retains its focus on critical issues? And I think that's something that the declaration also tried to balance, one part geopolitics, one part geoeconomics. And I think in particular, there was a balance between the concerns that were being expressed about Russia and the concerns that were being expressed about the developed world, and in particular, for example, US Federal Reserve that had been raising interest rates very, very aggressively, creating volatility across markets, across the world. So I think there was the sense that you need macroeconomic stability, you need financial stability, as well as broader geopolitical stability. And I think that's why this G20 has been pretty unique. And hopefully India's presidency will also take these conversations forward.
India has taken over the presidency at a time which is very challenging. Also, as you referred, the fault lines are wider than ever, and these economic platforms were dominated by the geopolitical developments. It's a big challenge for India going forward. Also, we saw that when the draft was being prepared, there was a lot of discussion, and the entire problem was about the wording of the communique, considering there were two blocks, in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war. Which side was the world? The world is very divided on these issues. So it's going to be very challenging also for India.
Very challenging. And I think, what we have seen, a kind of a trailer in this during the Bali summit. If the present trends continue over the course of next few months, then again, it would be India's challenge. How do you bring these countries together? And I think India, therefore, is in a unique position at this point because the world is divided. The fault lines are very explicit. And there are multiple fault lines. One, of course, was between Russia and the West. But also there's the developed fault line that was also in play, because after all, this is a platform that gave voice to the emerging powers. And in a sense, the developing world was also supposed to be part of this discourse, because increasingly the idea was that global economic problems, global governance problems in the economic realm cannot merely be dealt with by the developed world. So you had G7 or G8 initially, and that was seen as insufficient. So I think the idea was that let's bring in newer voices, emerging voices also to a platform where multiple stakeholders can sit together and craft solutions to global problems. So I think those fault lines are quite vivid today, because even the developing fault line is becoming sharper given the economic deceleration that the world is passing through. And at this particular point, you need a country that can bridge that divide. And India is seen by many countries as having that ability to voice the aspirations of the global south, as well as continue its engagement with the north and with the developed world. Also, what we saw during the Russia West conflict, that I think has also been quite interesting, because we have seen a lot of interesting statements that, look, India played a very important role behind the scenes in crafting the declaration, even in Indonesia. And this is, I think, a testament to the weight that India has gained and the ability of India to make its points convincingly to the other side. And so you had this famous, statement that this is not the era of war that was used in the declaration. Prime Minister Modi's statement to President Putin at the SCO summit this year. I think that has taken, in some ways, engagement at a certain level by India, and India's role as a central actor in a lot of these conversations, becoming more potent. I think that has been one of the more interesting things that has come out, because that means that as India takes over the presidency and as India galvanizes the world towards the next stage of G20, towards finding some credible solutions to geoeconomic and geopolitical problems, that gives G20 a certain weight in global politics. And Prime Minister Modi was also pointedly took UN to task, for example, when he said that, look, UN has not been fit for purpose. And I think that is, in a sense, that the burden on G20 is increasing. G20 again was not made for peace and security issues. But now that the UN is not working efficiently, that the UN has been a mute spectator to a lot of these crises, one after the other, that there is an expectation that G20 can do that. And I think we have to be a bit more
Sure.
calibrated in our expectations, because again, we know the fault lines, but we also know the limitations of what G20 can and cannot do.
Sure. Like you said, the relevance of G20 at this moment was highlighted, and it is more relevant than before, also because Prime Minister Modi also pointed out about the uh, failure of United Nations in living up to what it was supposed to be doing. There were many pull asides. Prime Minister Modi also had a couple of meetings, but all eyes were on the Xi-Biden meeting, which took place after the heightened tension which was created after Nancy Pelosi's visit. So this time, when the two leaders met, what changed? Beijing, the statements that it put forward after that, the tone and tenor was much softer. The words that they used earlier, I remember the words that Beijing was using was whoever interferes in our issues is playing with fire or things like that. But now, of course, Taiwan was mentioned, Xinjiang, human rights. Biden brought it out, but there was no comment on that. But Beijing still had a softer tone after this meeting.
I think there are two things. One, Beijing came to this meeting perhaps prepared to be more engaging with the rest of the world, and so there is certainly an attempt post the 20th Party Congress by Xi Jinping to appear more reasonable, not in action, but in words perhaps. And I think diplomacy, because a lot of what Beijing has done in the last few years has been this sort of a more aggressive, very wolf warrior kind of diplomacy. I think that there was a distinct attempt that you saw Beijing trying to make it softer, trying to soften the rougher edges, and this outreach by Xi Jinping was seen as an attempt during G20. Now, with Mr. Biden, of course, the issue is that, look, the two countries have their positions laid out very, very clearly. They know where, what their strategic agendas are. They know what their strategic trajectory are. Xi Jinping has outlined it in very clear terms at the party congress, recently held party congress, and the Biden administration has outlined it very clearly, both in its national security and national defense strategies, as well as in their actions. So I don't think there is any doubt as to where the two countries want to go vis-a-vis each other. The challenge here is, how do you manage the competitive elements of this relationship so that this competition does not spill over into an open conflict or open hostilities. And for any two leaders of these are the two worlds most important powers, economically, politically, diplomatically, and militarily. So if I think top level engagement is necessary. Top level engagement is necessary not only for them, but I think for all for also for their partners and allies and even adversaries, to understand their engagement, because that engagement has spillover effects into other relationships. So I think it was prudent on their part to meet, although again, what we saw was both sides, perhaps softly than before, outlined their agendas, their initiatives, their differences, but there's been certainly a softening of the tone. There has been the aggressiveness of the past seems to be on the margins, and the two sides did make an effort to seem reasonable. But I think the strategic logic of their relationship remains where it is. So it's about tactical accommodation of tactical diplomatic accommodation of each other at this particular point, when the world is already facing so many challenges. I think the attempt, especially by the Biden administration, would be to see how this relationship can be managed with all its strategic complexities, in a manner that there are no open hostilities in the near future. And that's the reason perhaps we'll see Secretary of State Blinken also traveling to Beijing very soon. But I think that's the logic that they have in mind. I don't think it changes anything fundamentally in the relationship, but certainly it gives them a bit more space to do some diplomatic jugglery, which allows them to have some kinds of conversations, especially on issues of global governance, like climate change, like economic activity around the world, where perhaps it at one point it looked as if they are unable to even do that. So I think that might be the ambition here. How far that ambition succeeds remains to be seen.
Yes, so the fundamentals of the relations haven't changed, but of course it gives them space for some diplomatic jugglery. But back home, it has been a blow for Biden, and it's going to get more difficult for him in the next 2 years of his presidency. There might be a showdown, because the Republicans, like we discussed earlier, and we were wondering what would happen, but the Republicans have gained control of the House of Representatives, even though with a narrow margin, and wasn't a red wave, but it's going to be a little more difficult for Biden and for his presidency. And how does it alter the power game?
Well, I think two or three things which are very clear, I think, from these elections. One, that of course the red wave did not happen, and the Democrats really were able to hold on to the onslaught by the Republicans. But I think in some ways, things have become even more complicated now, because there is no clarity in terms of the power equation that is now emerging. And of course, one of the salient things of these elections also is that both sides can claim victory. Both sides, Biden is saying that, look, this has been a good result, and of course, from what the expectation was, the Democrats have performed better, and the Republicans have not performed as per the expectations. So certainly there is that dynamic. But the Republicans do, and as we were expecting, they have ended up controlling the U.S. Congress, and that means that a lot of the agenda will be contested, will be, there'll be log jams, and in some ways, the Congress controls the finances, which makes it very difficult for any presidency to move forward on some of their key agenda items. But I think what it also shows somewhere, how divided the country is. If you look at these numbers, the polarization is almost extreme, because you have, almost 50-50 division in the Senate. You have almost a similar division in the House of Congress. If you look at the numbers of the governors that were elected, they were also 20 to 24, 20 Democrats, 24 Republicans. It's a country that is so divided that I think governing that country itself poses a problem. And that is where I think the second learning from this elections is that Trump's political future seems to be in jeopardy at the moment, though he has announced his candidacy. But I think the Republicans are also trying to find a way forward. And these results actually consolidated the fact that Trump's ability to win elections is getting weaker by the day. So while he remains very popular within the Republican Party, within the Republican rank and file, if you have to win elections today in America, you have to bring in new constituencies to yourself, and Trump is unable to do that. And therefore, DeSantis's victory in Florida becomes so important because he has been able to mobilize Latin Americans in his support, which is a new constituency for the Republicans there. And that means that Florida, being a battleground state where he won a second time as the governor, is going to give him a great boost for his Republican presidential ambitions. And I think this. The fact that Trump is making all kinds of statements about DeSantis shows that he's insecure, that he doesn't really know how his future will pan out. And I think that means that America, of course, for observers like us, it's an interesting time to observe the next 2 years how the presidential cycle moves forward. But I think it also means that a lot of the politics will be heavily contested, and that means that some of the policy initiatives of the Biden administration, Biden may find that he'll have greater difficulty, and that logjam will have implications for America's global role also, because a lot of the things perhaps that America and Biden administration may want to do, they would have constraints operating on them, including the Ukraine war. We have to see how the debate in the House of Congress pans out, but that there are suggestions that some in the Republican Party have called for a dialing down of support for Ukraine, and some in the Democratic Party also have engaged that this open-ended commitment is not feasible. So I think we are looking at some changes next year in terms of America, in terms of American foreign policy, as part of what has happened in the US midterms as well.
Absolutely. So, like you said, America, its domestic policies and politics, of course, is going to affect its leadership capabilities in the world. It will be difficult for Biden. A lot of politics and decisions will be contested, heavily contested. And of course, like a lot of newspapers reported and headlined that the real loser of the election, the midterm election, was Donald Trump. So it is clearly a blow to him as well. Before we end this discussion, also a quick comment, Harsh, on the ASEAN-India summit in Cambodia. Vice President Dhankar was there, and he did make a comment on how India is focusing, or India is supporting the centrality in the evolving regional structure in the Indo-Pacific of ASEAN. ASEAN remains central in this whole regional structure in the Indo-Pacific, and also reaffirmed the freedom of navigation. So interesting, looking at China's aggression in the region, and how ASEAN once again needs to assume that the central role.
Yes, I think for India, it is essential that ASEAN continues to be at the heart of India's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and ASEAN retains its centrality as a strategic player in the Indo-Pacific. And I think there has been some concerns expressed in ASEAN that given the dynamism that the idea of the Indo-Pacific has taken, and given the fact that Indo-Pacific is now the big buzzword, ASEAN may lose its centrality. And I think India is trying to reassure that from India's point of view, ASEAN centrality remains at the heart of its Indo-Pacific outreach. And therefore, it's important for ASEAN countries to also to get their act together. And I think that's the real dilemma here, because ASEAN itself is facing so many pressures. US-China contestation, the Ukraine war has also imposed costs. The fact that they are divided internally on a range of issues, including on Myanmar, all those issues have, are making it difficult for ASEAN to underscore their own centrality to the world. So I think while others like India want ASEAN to remain central, I think ASEAN itself is finding it difficult to come to terms with the changing global and regional environment. And that will be, if ASEAN does not get its act together, it is going to be a problem for countries like India. And therefore, India continues to insist on this, because India wants a united, robust, strong ASEAN, so that the challenges that are emerging, both from China's rise, but from the China's challenge to smaller countries in the region, as well as the greater geoeconomic shifts around the world, can be managed much more productively. So I think that is what New Delhi was expressing, and that is New Delhi's hope, that ASEAN centrality, because can be preserved and protected, and in fact enhanced, given the challenges in the region, given how Indian foreign policy wants to operate in the region, and how India views its Indo-Pacific outreach, in which ASEAN is integral and central.
Yes, of course. Once again, India reiterated the centrality of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific region, in the regional structure, and of course, the G20 summit that took place also reinforced the relevance of G20 at this moment. Very interesting week that has gone by, geopolitically, if we look at the developments. So thank you so much for that analysis, Harsh. That's it from us on this episode of the Ideas Factory.
Thank you.